Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Your Mortgage Process. Of course, your host, Greg Wareham. We got a great guest for you today, Mr. Michael Signorile. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
It's great to have you. And look around, everybody. Look at the new set we put together for you. We'd appreciate if you dropped a few comments to let us know if you like it. We're pretty excited about it and hope you would like it as well. So, Michael, we had the opportunity to catch up. You're an architect, you're a consultant, you got all sorts of different things going on. Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm a registered architect in New Jersey. I'm also a facade engineer, passive house consultant, and I work full-time at Pavarini McGovern as our building envelope supervisor, a construction management firm in New York City.
All right, like how do you do 3 different jobs, Michael?
Yeah, not enough hours in the day. Definitely
That's why you go to the gym in the morning.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. All right, so let's talk about your primary job that you have right now. I know you work on a lot of high-profile buildings in Manhattan.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So we're a core and shell high-rise construction management firm. We do a lot of building repositioning, core and shell fit-outs, primarily commercial. We do condos and also some rentals, high-end rentals. The scale of our jobs, they typically range anywhere between 12 stories up to 60-story towers. And for us, we really, any sort of job, a cookie cutter job, that's not really what we're interested in. We're interested in the more boutique, jewel box sort of jobs. The jobs that make it a little bit more tedious to think about, understanding the logistics and the approach of the construction itself.
Yeah, so your job, I mean, these are like $100 million jobs plus, right? I mean, billion-dollar jobs. These are big jobs.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit off air before about a block in Jersey City. That was purchased, and you're converting it into 1,200 units.
Yeah. So currently, right now, we have a lot of jobs where there's a lot of owners who are gauging the market in terms of commercial spaces, what to do with all of these open, unoccupied buildings post-COVID. And the trend right now with a lot of these clients is to look at how do we convert these into residential units. So what does that actually mean, right? You have a full block building. Obviously, the light and air compliance needs to be achieved. So it really tends to lean more towards cutting light wells in the building, similar to the space we're in, adding a light well into it, getting that light and air requirement, and converting it into apartment units. So the building we're working on downtown in Manhattan, that's an existing office building, full block. We're adding, the interesting thing with that is once you convert it and you carve out the light well, you're gaining more FAR. So
now what's FAR?
That's the floor area. So your allowable floor area. So pretty much all of that FAR that was lost from the light well, we're now adding on top of the building. So we're doing a 10-story overbuild on this existing structure just based off of the FAR.
All right, so clearly Michael's wicked smart because you bring up a great point post-COVID. Right, so we got COVID, as everyone knows, they stopped going into the office. And now we have a real surplus of buildings that are unoccupied, correct? Because I know that commercial, we're really concerned about commercial real estate longer term. You see a lot of owners going in that direction, converting it?
We do, yeah. It was interesting. A couple of years ago, we saw a lot of commercial work coming in. Right now, the condo and commercial scopes of work, they're kind of iced. We're seeing a lot of the jobs go on hold with that. We're seeing a lot more life science and also rental. So a lot of the rental work that we're seeing, it's more of that repositioning scope of work that I mentioned,
So I got to go deeper on this 1,200 unit building. So you get this huge block in Jersey City. It's a monster project that you're putting together. So now when the owner decides they want to convert this, they're going to call you guys to figure out, okay, what's this thing going to cost me? How do we put it all together? What's the compliance associated with it? Because I would think residential space, are there different codes for that than commercial space?
There are in terms of the requirements for the loads. Structurally, you need to make sure the building is sufficient, especially once you're cutting a light well into it. You make sure you have the proper egresses, making sure there's proper path of safety to the ground. In terms of the requirements, otherwise not too much more than what I mentioned. Yeah, it's pretty similar.
From like a health and safety standpoint.
Health and safety, that's primarily what you're looking for. And then also just the light and air. That's really what it comes down to, making sure that you have a comfortable space for people to live in at the end of the day.
Now, what's the time frame associated with that? Because taking it from I want to do it to actually breaking ground.
So like you mentioned, how does that process essentially start for the most
part.
part.
Yeah, how do you put it together?
So the client will bring us in as a feasibility study for the most part to take a look at it, whether or not they bought the property or they're looking to potentially buy the property. It'll all start with doing a walkthrough of the job, putting together a schedule, an estimate, and then on top of that, the logistical approach for how we envision the job going. For the client, the main thing is the schedule and also the actual overall budget of the project.
Cost and how fast.
Exactly. Those are the main driving factors of it. And then once they get that understood, they then look for lending, obviously.
Now, what's a project like? How long does something like that take?
One like that, it takes, depending on whether or not you count pre-design, which would be the architect developing the drawings ready for filing to the permit. I mean, that can take 3 years easily, 3 to 3.5 years, depending on the path, right? If there's a variance required, it may take a little bit longer. But in terms of cutting out light wells in a building, supporting the floor structurally, doing the full fit out. Infrastructurally, you're changing your mechanical systems, your plumbing, all of these sort of commercial buildings.
But so there's individual units, right? So it's 1,200 units. I need separate heat. I need separate AC. I need individual plumbing.
It's a lot, a
like,
lot of fit
you
out.
need a lot of stuff. Now, do they gut a building like that and start over, or do you kind of work with the existing structure? Like, what's your process when you look at it? Probably whatever is the most cost-effective, timely way to do it.
Exactly.
And still staying within code on it.
Exactly. But the aesthetics are also a big part of it, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
making sure that what you're building and developing is something that's not an eyesore and something that you can sell eventually.
Yeah, and on both ends of it, so internally and externally. Because you get into Jersey City, I mean, people are going to pay for individual units. It's expensive in that area right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, that's a hot market. So I live there currently, as I mentioned to you before. Yeah. And right now, from when I first moved there to now, it's crazy seeing how much the prices are escalating.
It's changed. The whole state of New Jersey, the whole country has changed pretty significantly over the course of the past several years. Yeah. So internally, we have to. You go through all these plans. I would imagine there's some type of rent analysis done on it if they're going to rent them out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So our team, we also have an expert in building repositioning, and he'll take a look, like I mentioned before, about the floor area ratio, the FAR of the building. He'll take a look at that and assess if we're brought on board for a feasibility study and it's just a commercial building where it's a white box, right, the full open floor plate. Okay. He'll develop an overall layout. So once you cut in like a light well, for example, he'll say we can get per floor 20 units, 15 to 20 units, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms at the corner. Yeah. And we'll use that as the basis of information we're feeding to our estimating team. And they're the ones building out the budget off of that.
Now, does the cost change depending on what floor you're on and something like that? Or is it
absolutely.
Kind of,
Yeah. In terms of
construction.
renting.
Well, I know in renting, yes. And from a construction standpoint, so I'm looking at it like, okay, if I know I got 1,200 units as an example, and let's just operate on the presumption they're all the same. Yeah. So I built out 1 unit. Can I then just multiply that by 1,200, and that's probably my cost structure with it?
Yeah, for the most part. That's kind of how we look at doing it. There are certain things that may change at the corners of the buildings or as you get higher up, just based off of the size of structure. You know what I mean? Like, so for example, the loading at the top of the building is a little bit higher than the lower floors of the building, so you may need reinforcements, stiffeners in the wall. Your pipe sizing may change a little bit, but it's not much else other than that. So I mean, the cost per square foot, it's going to balance out equivalently. Okay.
It's really fascinating as there's so much involved with it. Oh, yeah. I get a question for you. Yeah. If you have enough money, can you basically do anything?
Oh, yeah, that's what it seems like, right? I mean, right now it seems like that, yeah.
Right, I mean, crazy. When you're going in, you're looking at this building, hey, I want this wild stuff going on. If you have the money to do it, from an engineering standpoint, you can probably make it work.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's just all about cost.
It's all about cost. And what we're seeing right now with a lot of the clients, they're very much driven on the amenity spaces. So as you said, can you do anything? They want to do anything and everything for the amenities because these are what are driving in people, whether or not it's for a rental or a commercial space.
That's a great point.
The amenities are the driving factor right now to get people to either to move in or to come back to work in the office.
So it used to be, I can remember when I was in school, they used to give you this example of like, here's the core business stuff you have to do, and here's like the periphery add-ons. Yeah. Like a hotel was always the example. So a hotel, you need a bed and you need this and you need that, but next thing is you need a hair dryer, and then you need, and you go out in the circle. I mean, when you're looking at these buildings they're putting together today, you obviously need all that core stuff. What is that additional stuff that's kind of almost become a requirement in some of these spaces?
We're seeing, pools, in-ground pools.
In the building?
Yeah, in the building. Podcast studios, something like this, in the building.
Really?
That's a requirement, yeah, definitely.
Nick, we need a podcast studio in Jersey City.
That's a hot item, yeah. Basketball courts, fitness centers, all of those sort of things that are smaller amenities, they're now becoming just almost a requirement, just because that's what people are leaning towards. That's how you get people back in the buildings.
It's all about the lifestyle.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and I guess I can really see that in that area, because really the lure of that area is your proximity to Manhattan.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So you get that proximity to Manhattan, but you want to be able to go home and have everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Restaurants? Are you seeing restaurants going into these types of buildings?
Not many.
No. Okay.
Yeah, no. They would only be in the storefront levels, your ground floor. That's really where you would have the amenity spaces. I think they don't want to mix the uses, and having, potential just regular visitors of the building go up 20 stories and could potentially access certain floors. So they kind of keep it differentiated in a sense.
That's a good point. Yeah. How about parking? How do they address that?
Parking is a challenge, right? I mean, it's a challenge for everyone in Jersey City, Hoboken as well. So it really depends on the building. Some of the lower levels of the buildings, based off of the FEMA requirements, they're using those floors to accommodate parking. Okay. And then some of the spaces, just depending on where they are located, if it's an existing building, you're kind of married to it at that point. So they try and get variances to allow you to, mitigate or alleviate some of the parking requirements. Okay. Yeah.
That's fascinating, Michael. And I know that their specialists work on the inside at the company you work with. You're an exterior specialist. So we were talking a little bit off air before this about birds and some of the requirements with birds, because they fly into the windows.
Yeah, yeah.
And we can't have that. We can't have birds dying flying into the windows. So tell us a little bit about that.
It's interesting. New York City, they've mandated Local Law 15, which is a requirement now for glass on the exteriors of buildings. So it's called bird-friendly glass, which is what they're utilizing for the lower 75 feet of your building, and then also at any sort of setbacks where you have green space. So essentially, birds, with the reflectivity of the glass, they're more prone to fly into it. In New York City, you see it all the time with existing buildings, birds dead on the ground. So right now, what they're looking at doing is implementing dot patterns, either etch or frit onto the glass, or also a UV coating, which the birds can see. It's not visible to the human eye. If you look at it in certain shades, you can see maybe a purplish tint, but it's primarily visible to the birds. So they utilize tunnel testing, where they set up a tunnel based on the birds' migratory paths over in the sticks of the state, the sticks of the United States, and they test this glass to make sure that the threat factor is low enough where the birds don't hit the glass. So it's interesting.
It's fascinating, because it does have. I know birds fly into my bay windows of my house, and unfortunately, it'll kill the bird. But it's great to see that they're doing something like that. Number one, but also from a cost standpoint, I think that starts to ratchet up the cost.
It definitely ratchets up the cost. We're seeing it adding another $5 to $10 a square foot based off of what system you're using on the glass. So if you're utilizing the UV, it may be $10 more. If you're utilizing a dot, that's maybe $5 more. Okay. So we're seeing that, and we're also seeing electrochromic glass, which is something a little bit different, where they actually have a film that's applied to the glass, and there's an electric charge that goes to each unit of glass, and you're able to control it with an app or with a telecom on the roof, and it's able to actually sense and detect where the sun is at different times of day, and tint the glass based accordingly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about being the exterior specialist. I saw this show, and it was about a building they built in Chicago. Okay. And apparently the heat reflection of the glass was so hot, it was literally melting other buildings.
Yeah. I know the building you're talking about,
It's like this red building. It's really, I forget what they called it. But
there's another one like that too, the walkie-talkie building, exactly the same thing. And that comes from, poor planning and oversight in a sense, where you're not doing your due diligence with the assessment and the analysis of the building itself. So,
you just focus on aesthetics.
Exactly, yeah. So I know one building, I believe it was the walkie-talkie one, they had the same issue, and this is over in the UK. They actually wound up adding at each floor level louvers on the building to mitigate that reflection, because it was doing similar to what you're saying. I think it was actually burning paint off of cars based off of the reflection.
Ridiculously hot.
Yeah, exactly.
Now when you're looking at things, is that the type of stuff that you do, Michael?
Yeah. Okay. So for us, what we do in terms of my role at Pavarini McGovern as a building envelope specialist, I'll be involved in the projects from pre-construction. So as I mentioned, we work either as a CM agent or CM at risk, depending on which role we have.
Now, what's CM mean?
Construction manager.
Okay, got it.
So we'll start the job on the pre-con side, informing the client and the design team on constructability, evaluating the costs, and also just the sequencing and phasing of the work. So we'll start very early on informing the design team Once the design is developed and baked up to a certain point, we'll take those drawings, go out to the street. We'll go out to maybe 10 bidders, say, this is what we're thinking. We believe this is the most cost-effective way to do it. Can you achieve this? And at that point, we'll look to then buy the project from them. So it'll be more of a design assist based role. The design documents that are developed by the architect, they're more for schematic purposes, but those drawings aren't really what are being used to build the building.
Now, I got to walk through your kind of day in the life of Michael. So, all right. So, if you're looking at a building, right?
Yeah.
So, you go outside, you're looking at it. Do you start coming up with different ways to make it more appealing? If you're going from commercial to residential, like, what's the process with that? Because there's a certain amount of artistic flair for what it is you do, plus the engineering and everything else. So,
I think with that, it depending on the use of the building, it's critical to understand, not only the use, but also the demographic you're trying to reel into the building.
Sure.
So if it's something that you want to have as like a Class A high-end space, what are these finishes, and what does that pertain to? So are you doing more blackened metal, bronze? Is it terracotta? If you have a building that's a little bit less, I don't want to say like a B style building or a C style building.
There's different levels.
There's different levels.
You want to be luxury.
Exactly. If you want more luxury, you want that stone, terracotta, blackened metal. You don't really want to see stucco on the outside of your building. So those sort of things really inform the design. And when we're looking at it in terms of building repositioning, it's stating, the existing building right now, is there anything you can reuse on the outside? Or are you completely ripping the skin off of the building? If you're ripping the skin off, how does that play a role on the edge of your slab of the building? So are you needing to add additional reinforcement? And it's a balancing game with that. So when like you asked, when I go outside, am I thinking of these things? Yeah, I'm thinking of that, and then also the life maintenance of the building. So if you have a giant piece of 10 by 10 glass in Manhattan, how are you replacing that glass if it breaks?
That's a great
So
point.
those are the items that I'm thinking of, just based off of the construction management side, where we're looking at more of the efficiency aspect and the future life for the client. So that's what I'm primarily looking at.
That makes total sense. Though.
How are you cleaning the glass? All these little things. That's what I think about. Which is a crazy thing to think about.
Well, no, but people don't think about that, right? Oh my God, it's fantastic. I love it. I love the way it looks. Well, how are you going to fix it? How are you going to clean it? What's the maintenance involved in it? Because these big buildings there's high maintenance costs associated with keeping them so they don't go into any type of disrepair.
Oh, absolutely. And we're seeing a lot now where clients are looking at potentially glazing the building from the interior of the building. So when I say glazing, I mean the means that the glass is attached to the building itself. There's ways where it can be glazed from the outside of the building or the inside of the building.
To secure the window.
To secure the window. So they're looking at more or less ways to install the glass from the inside, so if it does break, you can replace it from the inside, which mitigates mitigates the need for having a building maintenance unit, dropping the building with buckets, having the guys clean it and access the glass from the outside.
It breaks, the cranes, there's so much involved with it. From the inside, it's much easier.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. So what else goes on in your day today, Michael?
Sure. So for certain jobs, like I mentioned before about the pre-con aspect of it, that's one part of it. The design assist role, so our company will play an active role with the design team in developing the design assist. So once we bring the subcontractor on board, we'll have design charrette meetings, depending on the job. I work on all of our jobs, so I manage and direct the building envelope for Pavarini McGovern. So if we do a weekly charrette per project, developing the design, once we get to a certain point, those drawings are then released for fabrication. So whether or not it be for a visual mock-up or a performance mock-up, obviously we're not going to fabricate 100,000 square feet of the exterior of the building without the client signing off on it. The glass, the finishes, that's critical. So once that's established, I'll be involved in the review, the QC of the mock-ups. Last week I was over in North Carolina looking at metal for a church we're doing over on 90th Street by Central Park. Where else was I? Indianapolis, looking at brick for another project. So it's really about the quality control and the QCing of all of this material.
It's interesting too, and it never occurred to me, every individual component has to be fabricated.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you're not walking into Lowe's and buying this stuff.
No, not at all.
There's companies, hey, this is what we want, and you got to roll these things off your assembly line.
Exactly, and the coordination of that is critical. It's very expensive.
Yeah.
But you think about the coordination, right? Like, you're essentially turning the keys over to a subcontractor who doesn't know the job, doesn't know why you're doing certain things on the job, and you're expecting them to fabricate your project.
Right.
And everyone is expecting material to be on the job site within 8 months, right?
Right.
So getting them up to speed and making sure the client is comfortable, the design team is comfortable, that's something we need to liaise on in the process as the construction manager.
And nothing can be, like, you can't even be off 1/8 of an inch on something.
Yeah.
It has to be perfect.
Exactly, yeah. For
Or
certain
won't
items.
fit.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we have to look at. The
Yeah.
tolerance is making sure that within the scope of work, we're buying out the correct construction tolerances. So for concrete, you have to automatically assume that the concrete can be in or out of tolerance by 1 inch.
Sure.
Right? Just a matter of fact. And for the exterior of the wall, these guys have such tight tolerances because, panels, they're stacking, the wall needs to be plumb. So their tolerances are much tighter than that, but they need to accommodate for that in case the concrete is out.
Sure.
So for us, looking at that in regard to constructability, that's big for us.
So I'm thinking, if you're doing a high rise in Jersey City, or you're working on something in Manhattan, wind is an issue.
Wind is a big issue. Yeah.
Have you heard of Gallop and Gertie?
No, I haven't.
So Gallop and Gertie was this iconic bridge I think it was out in Washington State, Michael.
Okay.
Where they didn't account for winds over a certain mile per hour.
Jeez.
In the video, you're gonna have to Google it later and look at it. Check out the Google machine; it'll tell you. But it starts swaying. Eventually, the whole thing snaps and tumbles to the ground because they didn't account for the wind correctly.
So it's actually interesting because for high rises, they'll do a couple of different things. We'll start with the theoretical calculations for the wind loads of the building.
Okay.
There's assumptions for the superstructure, and then assumptions for the cladding. So your windows, your glass, your metal, all of that sort of stuff. There's a secondary assumption. You'll start with those theoretical calculations, and then from there, you'll take the overall massing of the building and they'll do a wind tunnel test. So they'll actually model out with small little pieces of wood, a large footprint of the context of the block. So you'll model your building, the surrounding buildings, and then they'll actually put it in a wind tunnel. And they
Like
have
a physical wind tunnel.
A physical wind tunnel, and they have sensors on these little blocks,
Yeah.
and it's very accurate. You're able to actually depict and calculate the correct wind loads based off of that.
And then you just scale the thing up.
You scale it up. That info is then provided to the subcontractor who's doing the work, and they validate it, and they design all of their structural elements based off of that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and then once we get into performance mockups, so there's a couple of different approaches. You have the visual mockup, which is to approve and release the visual aesthetics, so your finishes of glass, if the color is okay, the tint, your metal panel, if the finishes are okay, constructability, if everything looks clean, minimal, everyone's happy with that. Once that's done, then it's released for performance mockups.
Okay.
And the performance mockup really validates the performance of the system. So your air performance, your water, and then the acoustics, right? So when you're doing the air and water testing, they have a couple of different standards. One being the dynamic testing, where they actually set up a giant jet engine in front of the mock-up. The mock-up can be 1 or 2 stories. You blow air at it, and you have a spray rack of water set up in front of it, and it's supposed to simulate hurricanes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's an AMA. That's the AMA standard, AMA 501.2 and AMA.
And they're still doing this physically, right? It's not just computer generated. You have to
physically, yeah. So there's testing agencies. It's interesting. If you go to York, Pennsylvania, these people live off of this. There's multiple testing. Yeah, it's what they do.
That air conditioning unit.
You wouldn't believe it though. You go out there and you see all of these mock-up facilities and parts and components of buildings being tested. It's amazing, actually.
That's pretty cool. And you bring up a good point too with the acoustics.
Yeah.
I recall a building out in L.A. that was built, I think it was a Disney building that was built out there, and the acoustics were, for whatever reason, when sound came across this building, it like resonated this horrible sound, and they had to fix it.
Yeah.
And these are little things that you don't think about as a consumer. You don't think about it, right?
Absolutely. It's critical for us in terms of apartment buildings, making sure that you don't have flanking in the walls, making sure acoustically that rooms are comfortable and they're efficient. So for one of our jobs we're repositioning right now, we're redoing all of the windows, new ribbon windows across the entire building.
Okay.
Now those windows obviously are dying into a wall. If it's a ribbon, how do you terminate that? And what is being used to damper and buffer acoustically between the rooms? So coordinating all of that and making sure the contractor can, properly assess and simulate it, it's critical. So we're doing a small mock-up for the acoustics to make sure you can't actually hear any flanking room to room.
Sure,
very
makes
interesting.
sense.
Yeah.
I watched too much TV apparently, so I was watching this show, and they were looking at different earthquake proof buildings, and they literally have like this damper that weighs some amazing amount of weight to try and it actually moves and stabilizes depending on the shaking of the building. And they did it for wind, they did it for a lot of different things. Really remarkable.
Yeah. When I actually worked as a consultant, we did a job over in Santa Monica, and we had to do actually that crescendo test, it's called, I believe. It's AMA 507, I think, and they actually have 2 stories of the building. Yeah, that's 2 stories of the building, and they actually calibrate the sway to make sure that the building doesn't rack and the exterior glass doesn't break as the building shifts.
That's great. It's amazing how detail-oriented everything is.
Oh, yeah.
So Nick asked me a question. He's off camera and he yelled it at me. He threw something at me, actually. But, I don't take that personally, Nick. I love you. You know that. And he was asking about that building in New York City that was sinking a little bit. Like, what happens? Like, how does that happen?
It happens a lot it starts with the soil, right? I mean, making sure that the loads being applied directly to the soil can bear the capacity that you're putting onto it. And the building, I believe the building is located over near Battery Park. It's a high-rise building. And as they started doing the structure, there was differential settlement and the building actually started sinking. So, at that point, it raises the question, what do? You have a building halfway up, you have the glass on your building, you have interior finishes on the building. How can you actually support and underpin this building while you have all of this taking place?
Right.
It's very costly to do.
Sure.
And to evaluate that, it's a challenge.
It's fixable, though, for the right cost.
It is fixable for the right cost.
Okay.
But the thing is, at that point, it's who's to blame? Do you blame the concrete subcontractor? Do you blame the structural engineer?
Right.
Do you blame the general contractor?
Right.
There's a lot of finger pointing.
I
And
could see that.
It's hard to...
Because it's big money, too.
Very big money to do something like that. So I can understand right now probably the client, they don't have the stomach to just pay it out of their pocket.
Sure.
That's who would be able to consider that off the top of their head? 10% of the building value to repair and underpin the building.
So in New York City, when you're building a high-rise, you have to drill pilings into there's bedrock that you have to drill it into.
Yeah.
Correct?
It depends. On certain jobs, you have to drill into the bedrock. Other ones, you're doing either like a mat slab or just micro piles, where there's small piles going directly down, just enough to support the loading. It depends on the area, because there's a lot of bedrock midtown.
Yeah.
As you go lower, there's not as much bedrock and there's more water.
Makes sense.
So
makes sense.
For a lot of our jobs, if it's uptown, we don't have an issue with, like you said, the bedrock or water. But downtown, once you actually have a hole in the ground, it can be 12 feet down, 15 feet down. You're pumping water. Yeah, nonstop.
So then, what do you pour concrete in it as you're pumping the water out?
You pump it. You have pumps that go in first.
Right.
You excavate down to the point where you need to, and as you're pumping, then you start doing your waterproofing layer, your rebar, and you start to pour. And at that point, once you get
this stuff out,
I know it's
amazing.
Yeah.
So, all right, though, I don't know if you can answer this question, but I was driving into the city with my family within the past month.
Yeah.
And we're going through the tunnel, and every time I go through the tunnel, I think we may have been going through the Lincoln on the way there, not the Holland, but either one. I'm thinking, how'd they build this? Like, how do you go under the bedrock to build it? Like, how do you build the tunnel and the water doesn't just crush the whole thing?
I go through that
100 years ago.
I go through the tunnel every day.
Yeah.
And as I go through it, I think to myself, I need to YouTube how they built this.
We're doing it after the show.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
we're going to figure this out.
I would love to figure that out.
But it is amazing. And it's 100 years ago they're doing this, 120, however long ago.
And they're talking right now about building a new tunnel, I believe, closer towards Weehawken.
Oh, really?
Yeah, going directly into the city.
They could use one.
Yeah, definitely.
Going
based off
of
all the congestion, they need something else.
Hey, so different buildings have different construction, there's different contractors used. I don't know if this is a question you can answer, but as a consumer who's going in to buy a unit in one of these buildings, are there things that they could look for that could identify the quality of the construction that was done to it?
It's hard if the consumer is going in because they're going in at the end of the project, right? I mean, they can potentially ask for project reports. So in any terms of any sort of inspections that may have been done, punch listing from the architect, understanding and assessing what has been reviewed previously. Sure. By the time they come in, it's the lipstick is already on the pig.
Yeah.
So it's hard to tell what has been done with the walls up,
No, it's a good point.
Yeah, so it's a challenge. I mean, they can, do their best efforts of, checking all the hardware and the windows, making sure everything locks properly, making sure there's no water. I mean, it's always an indicator for staining. If you see staining on the windows or
around the sill anywhere.
On the sill, exactly, on the mullions themselves. If you see any sort of issue with the ceiling, stuff like that. But
I guess at the end of the day, you just have to
challenging.
trust the process.
You have to trust
that
the
it was
process,
done correctly, and it becomes so much more. It's just so scaled up, right? Because you buy a single-family home.
Yeah.
You know, you can just go through it in much more detail to look at everything. You really can't do it in a big complex that's been put together.
Exactly, yeah. It depends really on the pre-qual process that we take on board when we're awarding these subcontractors, right? Making sure that the people we're awarding are, fit to do the job. So for us, I mean, I don't want to guarantee it, but I think a lot of our projects, they're
Phenomenal quality.
phenomenal, exactly, phenomenal
And you
quality.
pick all the contractors and everything like that?
We usually do. We'll look for what subcontractor is the best fit on the job, whether it's union, non-union, and assess,
Well,
based off of the scope of work.
Both too, yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a big company that you work with.
Yeah. So we do a lot of, like I said before, high-rise repositioning work. We're in process of completing a job over in Times Square, TSX, 1568 Broadway.
Okay.
And this job, it's very exciting, where we took an old theater, jacked it up 30 feet, built new retail below it, and then on top of that, we did an overbuild of another 30 stories. And this was an existing theater and hotel space, so we demoed down the existing to the 16th floor, rebuilt on top of it.
It's amazing. It's amazing what can be done.
Yeah.
Right? I grew up in the south of Boston, the Boston area. When they were doing the big dig, I had just moved out, but it had been a project that went on forever.
Yeah.
But just the ability for people to plan, just the water, just in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do I plan in an old town, Boston, New York City?
Yeah.
How do you renovate that, right?
Yeah.
And just the engineering that goes into it's really mind-blowing.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I think it really starts from, there's two things to that, right? It's understanding when you're going to be building, right?
Well,
Are you going to be building in the summer, in the winter? How does the climate play a role in what you're constructing? And then,
great point.
Yeah, and then two, like, how is the design itself informed by that climate, right? I mean, with all of that water, are they doing different wet or dry flood mitigation methods to make sure that you're not going to get water in once it's occupied? Right?
And then also accounting for different expansion and retraction.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because you're building in the winter, it's contracted, right?
Yeah.
It expands in the summer,
Yeah.
and you got to factor all that stuff in.
We see that a lot with certain jobs where, depending on what time of year it's constructed, where things are put on the building, or even if you give it a couple of cycles where, you potentially have glass breaking just due to the shoulder seasons, which is the spring or the fall. The glass on your windows, depending on the material used, it's called nickel sulfide. It's a material within the glass, and it's pretty much based off a thermal shock, right? So if you have the temperature drops significantly at night, where you have 30, 40 degree temperatures, once the sun hits in the morning, if that glass is spiking up to 80, 90 degrees, the glass can spontaneously break just based off of the expansion of the nickel sulfide in the glass. So we had a couple of jobs where that happened, where 10, 12 pieces of glass broke, and we're replacing them based off of that. So
I'm thinking
it's hard. It's hard to, you can't really factor or gauge that sort of thing.
Well, I just thought of the desert, like you're building something in Vegas.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's massive temperature swings that you have to account for, and how the elements, the structure that you're building, how they're going to react to all that.
Yeah.
And you got a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy to accommodate that. So what we typically do with the performance mock-ups, as I was mentioned before, we do the static air, the water, and also the thermal testing. So thermal testing is an additional one, and also the acoustics I mentioned. So the thermal testing, they'll put sensors inside of the mock-up itself, and they thermally cycle it. So they'll do temperature swings from 0 degrees up to 220, 0, 220, 0, 220, and they do it for about a week.
Okay.
And you actually assess the expansion and contraction of the materials and make sure that nothing is significantly compromised over time.
Right.
Yeah. And once that's done, then you redo the water testing to make sure.
They're probably almost doing it on a microscopic level too. Is there some sort of hairline fracture?
Something,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Where you really got to go deep and look at it. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Now, from an architect standpoint, you're an architect.
Yeah.
You design single-family homes?
Yeah, so single-family homes, looking at, zoning analysis.
You work with real estate agents with zoning?
Yeah, exactly.
Like
so if a real estate agent has any questions in regard to zonings, like I mentioned to you earlier, it's interesting because right now the current trend in the market is a lot of real estate agents looking to list off-market properties.
Sure.
So for them, it's really what can you gain? What's the best bang for your buck out of these properties? So it's an interesting approach to it where they want to start, from zero, saying we have this lot, what's the potential of it? And sell it based off of that. So they'll be doing that analysis, and then also maybe doing renderings or some sort of charrette with that to take a look at.
And you can do all that.
Yeah.
He does.
Yeah.
Are you open for people reaching out to you if they have any questions about, needing an architect or real estate agents that have questions about these things?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really amazing, Michael.
Yeah.
Hey, is there anything that we're missing about the process at all, what you do? I know it's complicated. You probably talk about it for hours.
I think the one critical component that we didn't touch on is actually building it, right? So once we get the superstructure up and we're doing stuff on the exterior of the building, what does that equate to? So getting the material to site, making sure we're hitting schedule, right? Because you want to make sure you're hitting schedule, but you're also hitting it in a way where you're building safely and also making sure quality isn't compromised.
Sure.
So those are the critical aspects to us.
I mean, the inspection levels with what go on must be amazing.
It's very thorough. We have inspectors every day on job sites.
Have you ever walked into a project that's being done, you're like, that's not right?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Just seeing it in Manhattan all the time. Yeah, just walking around. On our jobs especially.
Yeah. What's
you
part of
have to
what you do,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You have to be thorough and understand, look, if it takes a week for them to fix something, it's required, so we got to do it. So.
I mean, the contractors see you coming and they're like, oh my gosh, Michael's going to not like what I did.
Yeah. Well, thankfully for us, when we sign on board the contracts, we tell the subs, look, we're not looking for somebody to yell at. We're looking for a partner. So we're trying to bring a partner on board, someone who's just as ambitious and appreciative that we're getting the opportunity to build these jobs.
So Michael, we're living in the world of eco-friendly, rightfully so, with climate change and everything like that. What are some of the things that you have to do with construction now to make sure it's eco-friendly?
Yeah.
What's the process on that?
There are a couple of different certification paths for making sure a building is eco-friendly, and these certification paths eventually lead to tax credit incentives to the owners. So what we're seeing is a lot of owners going the route of doing a LEED building. LEED being LEED accreditation or certification. They have different criterias going from silver to platinum, and it's really based off of the procurement path and the carbon emissions of the materials you're getting. How is that material fabricated? Is there any sort of off-gassing VOCs?
It goes that deep.
It goes very, very deep. Yeah. So they'll base it off of that. Water being utilized if it's close to transportation hubs. How are you actually accessing the building? Those are critical for us to look at with LEED. There's WELL as well. And WELL looks at the health and comfort occupancy levels. So, there's proper ventilation in the buildings, airflow, light, green, whether or not you have vegetative spaces.
Right.
That's what they would look at with WELL. There's also Passive House. We're seeing a lot of Passive House now.
What's that mean?
Passive House, it's a certification where you're building the building extremely airtight to mitigate any sort of leakage in the building. So your temperature within a Passive House building, it's typically around 70 degrees throughout the year, and it's based off of the insulation you're using in the wall, the airflow circulation with your mechanical systems, and high-performing windows.
And that's great. The government, state, local government, kind of incents all of that.
Exactly.
Federal government incents all of that.
And even the electrochromic glass, which I mentioned before, that's something right now that they're utilizing an investment tax credit in New York, where if you utilize that product, you can save 30 to 40%, depending on if it's fabricated domestically and if the material you're installing is domestic too. So
that's great.
It's great that they're doing this. Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, it's great that they're doing all these things to preserve the environment. With climate change going on right now, have you seen things change with when you can do work, or how's that impacting the business negatively, if at all?
Not really. I mean, for us, it's schedule first always. So in terms of climate change, it's not really impacting us. We notice a lot during the pre-design and pre-construction that the thermal analyses and models that are being performed are now taking into these more extreme temperatures and temperature swings. So understanding when you may have condensation on the inside of your glass, that's changing a lot now because of these temperature swings.
That makes sense.
Yeah. In New York City as well, they've also changed their building code to accommodate for more insulation, stricter R values for your wall, which is the resistivity, and the glass. So your U value on the glass.
Is anybody worried at all about sea levels rising? Do you hear anything about that?
Not really. I haven't heard much about that. I know based off of the FEMA requirements, that's really what we're focusing on. So whether or not we're doing wet or dry flood proofing, barriers, or if the glass is aquarium style glass, which is what they call it, where the glass is fully structurally sealed and water can't get into it. But it's hard because even if you design based off of that, you're also looking more at, it's not just the flooding, right? It's the impact of debris hitting the building, whether or not you have a garbage can going adrift, right?
I was reading an article the other day about the Greenland ice sheets, and apparently they thought these things have been under ice for millions of years.
Yeah.
Come to find out, they've only been under the ice for about 418,000 years because they were able to find the organic material going that far back. And as the sheets start to melt, if all of the ice in Greenland was to melt, it would raise sea levels, they say anywhere from 15 feet to 30 feet.
Yeah.
And, you know, you could see 100 years from now, you know, if we don't make some changes as a culture, as a people, these sea levels will rise, and they'll really, your whole engineering end of it, that's going to have to even go to another level to protect these cities.
Well, I was even reading an article recently talking about New York 2050.
Yeah.
And they were stating that the sea level rise is going to be so immense that, you know, we are going to lose coastline.
Yeah.
Jersey as well. And it's how do you actually manage it, right? I mean, you have to have some sort of way to manage and lessen the blow. And it's hard right now because there's so many homes, especially along the Jersey Shore, that, you know, people have invested a lot of money into. What are they going to do? You can't just sell your property and uproot based off of something you're projecting 50 years out.
Exactly.
So it's hard to...
You know, you have that whole unknown with it, right? Are they really going to go up that high? What's really going to happen? We don't know.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. Interesting. Hopefully it doesn't change.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's changing the whole vernacular down the shore, right? I mean, you're now building up an extra story with a space beneath just to mitigate any sort of that water since Sandy happened.
No, it's a great point. I mean, you know, you come from the Jersey Shore area. You know, they raised everything. Changed the whole FEMA flood maps, obviously all changed and everything like that.
Yeah.
So, you know what? I got to tell you, Michael, it's been a real pleasure. You know, getting to know you and talk to you, and I'm very impressed by how smart you are.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I appreciate it.
It's fantastic. Hey, and if people are interested in any type of architectural planning or anything like that, Michael would be more than happy to talk to people, correct?
Absolutely. And feel free if you're interested also in any of the other work I do at Pavarini McGovern. We're open to help with any sort of projects in any shape or form.
Would you be kind enough to give your email address again?
Sure. Michael, Michael, .a.signorile, Signorile, @gmail.com.
Thank you so much for helping us. It was very informative. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed this a lot. Yeah. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for watching. Look forward to catching up with you next week with Your Mortgage Process. Greg Wareham, Michael Signorile. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Your Mortgage Process, hosted by Greg Wareham, produced by Greg Wareham and Nick Pavis at The Social Rift, and executively produced by The Social Rift. Thank you again for tuning in, and we look forward to catching up with you next week.